Thank you. Thank you. So, as noted, my name is Josh Ambrosius. I am at the University of Dayton, where I direct the Master of Public Administration program. And I also teach an interdisciplinary undergraduate course on space policy called Toward a Spacefaring Society. My work centers on space public opinion, on religion in space, and on teaching space policy. So the title of my presentation today is Space and Race. And the subtitle is a kind of a question. Is there what I'm calling a Sister Nell effect on Black Americans' space orientation? So you'll see from the title that I'm inspired by the 1970 spoken word performance by Gil Scott-Heron, the poet, who performed a piece called Whitey on the Moon that you may or may not be familiar with. So Gil Scott-Heron starts with the line, "A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still with Whitey on the moon." And you'll see the conclusion of this piece is on your screen right now. So this piece, coupled with some of the African American civil rights advocacy, inspired me to kind of go down this route and explore the space attitudes of Black Americans. So you see on your screen from the 1960s, this is July 1969, with African American activists making some of the same arguments that Gil Scott-Heron would make in his piece 1 year later. So this is the civil rights protesters outside the Kennedy Space Center that were organized by the preacher Ralph Abernathy, who's an associate of Martin Luther King Jr. And they came together there to protest the moon landing, mainly to bring attention to the fact that they, as they said at the time, 1/5 of the population lacks adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. All the same themes that you see in Whitey on the Moon. And fast forward to more recent times, around the time I began this study, which is the summer of 2020. We're in the midst of the pandemic. And writing at this time, you'll see a tweet here from the astronaut Victor Glover, who, along with other astronauts, Leland Melvin and others, expressed support for the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officers. So, when talking about race and civil rights, um, folks like Victor Glover were told, can't we just do space? Why are we focusing on things like race and civil rights? And Victor Glover responded to this critique, saying basically that we can't just do space, that as people, we need to work to overcome racism and bigotry so that we can together do space. So, given all that context, my research question is, are there differences in the US today in support of space exploration by race, and particularly among Black Americans? And then, given the answer to that question, if so, what explains any of these differences? So I'm going to be using probably the most common source of public opinion data on space exploration, and that is the General Social Survey, which has some really key space indicators, in some cases going back to the 1970s. So in looking at the literature, there's not a whole lot of literature out there on public opinion on space. So we have these data indicators from the General Social Survey, from the Pew Research Center, and others, but the actual peer-reviewed scholarship is pretty slim. Going back to 2011, we have two studies that look at a range of factors, um, but we never really get a focus on race as a key independent variable. One of these studies by Wendy Whitman Cobb looks at issue publics, where she finds that young male GOP or Republican, high education, high socioeconomic status individuals are more supportive of expanding resources for space exploration. This study has no mention of race. There is a multivariate study around the same time that brings race in a little bit by arguing that high socioeconomic status whites are more supportive of expanding financial support funding for space exploration. There are a variety of other studies, many by Whitman Cobb and myself, that look at support and kind of emphasize different key factors. These include religion, in my own work on the what I call the separation of church and space, where I find that evangelical Protestants really lag behind the population and other religious traditions in their support for space and their interests and their knowledge. A follow-up study of mine looks at whether evangelical support increased during the Trump era, given the Trump-Pence administration support for both evangelicals and seemingly for space policy. There's a variety of other studies appearing in some of the key journals in this field, Space Policy, Acta Astronautica, that focused on things like party, generation, geography, gender, media use, all as predictors of space attitudes. But we don't really get a focus in the literature, at least that I'm aware of, that focuses on race or Black Americans' attitudes in particular. So, to address my first basic question, do Black Americans differ from the population as a whole? I'm going to look at the three key variables that I identify in the general social survey. So, these are like outcome or dependent variables. So, I'm going to look at space spending support, I'm going to look at space interests, and I'm going to look at space science knowledge. So this first table here, or first figure, is going to compare the population and the Black subpopulation. For the measures in more recent years, I do include a Hispanic subpopulation for comparison purposes. Um, Now, one last thing here, these figures are going to emphasize the highest and lowest categories across the three measures, mainly for visualization purposes so that you can see differences. So this first figure you're looking at is support for spending more on space. So in this case, you do see an upward trajectory among the population and Black Americans since the 1990s. But if you look at the most recent year, you'll see that the population is approaching 25%, supporting more spending on space, while the Black population is around 15%, and the Hispanic population is somewhere in between. Now, looking at those who want to spend less on space, here we see a downward trajectory over time. We see that in the most recent year, the population's about 40% in support. And then if we look at or rather, the full population's about 25% in support of less spending. And the Black population is that about 40%. And again, the Hispanic population is somewhere in between. So we're just looking at spending more, spending less. The balance is in the spending about the same category. So moving on to a second space measure, here we get interest in space exploration. This measure is restricted to the most recent 10-year period when I pooled the general social survey. So here we'll see that the lines are pretty flat. There has been a slight upward tick since maybe 2014. We'll see that in this case, the population that says they're very interested is above 25%. And for Black Americans, it's around 20%. So not as much of a difference, but still about a five-point difference. When we look at the lowest category here, which is not at all interested in space, we'll see here that the population's about 30%. And for the Black subpopulation, we get a little bit less than 40%. So we have more Black Americans who are not interested in the topic of space. So bringing my third measure in, I'm looking at knowledge of basic space science. So the General Social Survey has a range of basic science knowledge questions. I've identified these three as being directly related to space science. Now, you'll notice the first two are pretty basic, right? Does the Earth go around the sun or does the sun go around the Earth? And then how long does the Earth go around the sun? With options ranging from a year to a day. The third item, according to astronomers, the universe began with a big explosion. Is this true or false? So on this question, we do see that some folks may be answering this because they believe that their deeply held religious beliefs are in opposition to a more secular explanation. Even though a Catholic scientist, came up with the Big Bang Theory, others might be looking at the wording here. Was it really a big explosion, right? So I separate two categories: those who got two or three of these correct, and those who got 0 or 1 correct. So those are going to be the highest and lowest categories. In this case, they're the inverse of one another because I do not have a middle category. So looking at space knowledge. So in this case, it's clear that the population as a whole is well above the Black subpopulation. So we have the full population at about 55% or so getting two or three of these questions correct. And for the Black population, we're a little bit below 40%. If we look at the inverse on this, in terms of those who got 0 or 1 correct, for the full population, it's a little less than 45% today. And if we look at the Black population, it is a bit over 60% that got no more than 1 correct. Interestingly, on these, and if I go back, Hispanics are pretty close to the full population numbers on both the highest and lowest categories. So I said I would be combining together these measures. So I create an index that I call space orientation that combines together space support for funding, space interest, and space knowledge. So really it is a standardized score, a summative index created from 3 standardized scores and then averaged. But for visualization purposes, I divide this measure up into 8 different categories. And my apologies, I did notice on this, I did flip the colors. So Black Americans in this table are, in this figure are blue, and non-Black Americans, instead of the population as a whole, are coded here as red. So what's the takeaway here? That the 4 lower categories, we see significantly more Black Americans represented than non-Black. And when we look at the top 4 categories, which might be closer to making up this issue public for space exploration, we see that non-Black Americans far outnumber Black Americans. And on that 8th highest category, we see virtually no Black representation there. So all this taken together, the question is, Why are Black Americans so much lower when it comes to support, to interest and knowledge than the population as a whole and non-Black Americans? So getting back to that Gil Scott Heron, that we use the Whitey on the Moon that we use to frame this study, um, you'll see that he's emphasizing a lot of really important policy problems that you're probably thinking are still with us today. Right? These weren't restricted to the late 60s, early 70s, right? We still struggle with all these things in today's society. So the thinking is maybe there's a trade-off, right? Maybe it's the case that Black Americans have different policy preferences. They want to see public resources devoted to solving some of these problems versus, space exploration funding. Um, now it is the case that these kinds of concerns are not limited to the Black subpopulation. They may be also associated with folks who are lower in terms of socioeconomic status, like income. You might want to see some of these problems addressed instead of spending resources elsewhere. They might also be associated with party and ideology, right? So the different political camps in the United States have different preferences for the kinds of functions, the kinds of policy problems that government should be doing or addressing. Um, so, in terms of the literature on this idea of a trade-off, um, there is one study by Burbach who looks at whether attitudes on space funding are associated with attitudes towards funding other policy areas. And this study is titled Partisan Rationales for Space. I had it on the previous slide as a study of party, but really it's a study of trade offs and trying to explain why one particular party might support might support space funding more than another. So he's looking at, in the US context, Republicans and Democrats. So the variables in this study explore attitudes toward science in general, like confidence or trust, support for defense spending, support for environmental protection policies, and support for social welfare spending. Concluding that both parties show a slight negative correlation between space and social welfare spending. Dig into those findings just a little bit more. The analysis is cut into examining all years in a regression model and then looking at some trend analysis over time, ultimately concluding that social spending shows an unexpected relationship with space spending. So while it was hypothesized by Burbach that there would be a negative correlation for Democrats, it's actually found that there's no significant correlation. And for Republicans, it's actually a small negative correlation. Democrats have not really responded to surveys as if they're motivated by this social space slash social welfare trade-off. Whereas Republicans who favor space and defense spending perhaps are even less likely to support welfare spending than the average Republican. And in the trend analysis, it's found that a negative social spending space effect for Democrats is actually quite weak. And for Republicans, there's almost the same negative correlation. So I did not know that this was a component of this particular study until after I conceived of the current study. But it's interesting to think about the fact that this suggests that there's maybe not that much of a space welfare trade-off happening in space policy attitudes, even among racial subpopulations. So to revisit my question and to wrap up the analysis, The revised second piece, what explains any differences is now what explains lower levels of support for space exploration among Black Americans. Some hypotheses, um, given the previous literature and given the variables available in the General Social Survey, are that it might be associated with education levels. It might be associated with political party or political ideology. It might be associated with various religion measures. It might be associated with attitudes towards science, trust or confidence. And in fact, General Social Survey has a measure of whether people think science is actually harmful to society. And then finally, that trade-off or that sister Nell effect, support for alternative government spending that addresses social inequities. So I'm going to look at measures on more spending on cities, on African Americans, or on social welfare policy. So in the General Social Survey, this is the question wording. Just kind of a quick aside here. Some scholars have argued that you cannot combine together two measures that have slightly different wording. So on space, for example, it says space exploration program to like half the sample and then space exploration to the others. Or you see here welfare to one subsample and then assistance to the poor to another. Um, I've actually found in my 2020 published piece that there's not all that much difference between the two space measures. And my other area of research and a big part of my graduate training was on urban policy. So I've actually analyzed the Nat City measures here and also did not find significant differences. I know some disagree with that, but I combine them together. So just looking at some of these alternative spending categories, um, just for illustration, I'm going to look at the urban or spending on big cities or the problems of big cities. So here we see mirrored trends among the population and among Black Americans over time, but we see that on the whole, Black Americans have always been above the population in supporting more spending for big cities. So bringing in space funding and urban funding, we see here that for the full population, it's also true that more people favor spending on cities than on space. Um, in the population figure here, you'll see that today it's about 40% on cities favoring more spending, about 25 on spending more on space. So that's about a 15-point gap. For Black Americans, we see, like the population, the gap's closing a little bit, but in most recent numbers, we see 45% favoring more spending on cities, and we see about 15% favoring more spending on space. So while the population, it's a 15-point gap, for Black Americans, it's a 30-point gap. So this lends credence. Maybe there is something to this sister Nell effect or this trade-off. So finally, let's look at the regression modeling. So I do a multiple regression with my space orientation index as the dependent variable. And then I bring in all these various independent variables that might help explain support for space. So I'm going to do a full model for the most recent 10 years of data. I'm going to do that model without and then with a 1-0 Black dummy variable. And then I'm going to do a model of just the non-Black population and a model for just Black respondents to the General Social Survey. The key independent variables follow all the hypotheses and then controls for male South age and for the Trump era, given some of my own findings. So this is the full regression model. I know it's tough to kind of look at this on a slideshow, but just to highlight a couple things. So the Black model, Black only model, performs quite poorly relative to the full model. The explained variation's about half. We also see that there are some variables that are important in the population model that are also important in the Black submodel. Some of these are less important in terms of looking at standardized coefficients. Some variables are not important anymore in the Black only model when compared to the full population model. And then when we look at these trade-off variables and try to see whether support for spending more on cities, Black Americans, or welfare are associated, we actually don't see that these measures are significant predictors in many cases. We do see kind of a negative effect on support for social welfare increases among the full population and among non-Blacks. But in the Black only model, we don't really see much going on here. And we even see a very modest positive effect on funding towards cities. So, what does this all mean? The Black only model performs more poorly, as I noted, than the full
Sorry,
sample.
Joshua. This is Oksana. So we have 3 more minutes left. So I wanted
Okay.
to let people know that they can type their questions now if they have any. And I wanted to let you know that
Okay,
three
yep, we'll
minutes
be
left.
done. I'll wrap up here in just a moment.
Thank you.
So like the other models, certain things matter, but some things don't matter. And on spending preferences, it's generally negative that people want more social spending. It's generally negatively correlated with support for space, for more space spending. But in the Black only model, it's a bit more inconclusive. So this study definitively establishes that Black Americans are less likely to support space exploration than the full population or the non-Black subpopulation. But the reason is not clear cut. It does not seem rather that preferences for social spending, that this trade-off is a clear driver of Black attitudes. Instead, Black attitudes seem to be, like the population as a whole, associated with education levels and science attitudes. So ultimately, how do we encourage a Black constituency for space exploration? Right, it's perfectly okay for individuals and populations to have different space, or different policy preferences rather, and maybe to not be into something like space exploration. But I think, like Victor Glover argued, there's no real trade-off here, that we can work to fix both problems here on Earth and prepare for a future in space by promoting general education and pro-science attitudes and continuing to expand diversity in the space field. So with that, I will stop sharing. And please let me know if we have questions.
Thank you, Joshua. We are waiting for people to type any questions if there are any.
Okay. And real quick, I will share if anybody's there that wants to reach out and discuss any of this with me outside of right now and the chat. My email address is jambrosius1@udayton.edu.
Thank
So
you, Joshua.
thank you.
Yes, and yes, we're going to end this session, but we have some more sessions running throughout till the end of the day. So if anybody wants to join, please take a look at our website. And thank you all for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.